Would you ask Dr Colwell to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Dr Colwell.
Yes, thank you.
We'll carry on then. Thank you. Yes, Ms. Grenfell.
Yes, thank you. Yes, good afternoon, Dr Colwell.
Lovely.
We were in the middle of discussing amendments to approved document B in 2006, and if we could pull up another document, CLG 402685. This is an email dated the 17th of August 2006 from Brian Martin to you, to Tom Lennon, Debbie Smith, copying in Peter Field and Sam Greenwood. And we can see that the email reads, please find attached the latest drafts of the ADB Volume 1, Dwelling Houses, and Volume 2, Other Buildings. Both documents should be treated as confidential. And then it goes on, the drafts are beginning to be finalised. I've set out below what I need each of you to do. Please feel free to look at any other bits that take your interest. And then there are names below that. And he says at the end of this email, can you please get back to me with comments, revised text by the 8th of September? Book your time to the DCLG support contract. And if we go down to the bottom of the page, we can see your name. And he says this, Sarah, can you take another look at the stuff on cladding and cavity barriers? Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
So it does appear from this email chain that you were involved in these revisions to the approved document and were being asked to check the sections on cladding and cavity barriers, yes?
That would appear to be the case, yes.
And when Brian Martin says, can you take another look in the covering email, so I'm just looking for that. I've set out below what I need each of you to do. Please feel free to look at any other bits that take your interest. Can you get back to me with comments? I apologise, I'm not sure he does say take another look. Do you know what the stuff on cladding and cavity barriers was that he wanted you to look at?
I'm really sorry, I don't know.
Okay. Now, I want to move on to some questions now about queries or debates within the industry about the meaning of the word filler material, etc. And if we turn first to your witness statement, page 106, paragraph 720, you were asked by the inquiry about any concerns you had in relation to the approved document on external fire spread. And at 720, just reading the first two lines, you say, I was becoming increasingly concerned by 2016 that the guidance in approved document B in relation to external fire spread was causing discussion over interpretation. And I have addressed this in my responses to the relevant questions above. And you say, I felt that the matter was understood by MHCLG and that the revision of approved document B would address this. Now, when was the first time that you became aware that the guidance was causing discussion over interpretation?
It would have been around 13.
Around 2013?
Yes.
Right. But not before 2013, do you think?
I'm not aware of it becoming a debating point in the way that it was from that period in 13 onwards.
Right. And if we look at page 107, the next page, paragraph 728, you say this, you were asked whether you were at any stage approached for advice on this subject by any organisation or individuals. And you say, yes, I received numerous requests for advice from organisations such as BBA and individuals over this period as set out in my answers to the questions above. However, as BRE is a testing and approval body, we would not have discussed interpretation of the building regulations regarding the suitability or otherwise of the use of combustible materials on buildings with a habitable story over 18 metres in height. Instead, we would have explained that interpretation could only be provided by MHCLG and Building Control, as this role sat with them. BRE's only substantive engagement would have been in response to a direct request for testing. The specification of the testing required would have been the responsibility of those seeking to have the test undertaken. So that's what you say about it there. in your statement. Now, is that right? Is it right that you did not discuss or provide any advice on the interpretation of the building regulations, because that could only ever be provided by MHCLG?
So people would ask, there would be a discussion around what their views might be, but the ultimate interpretation could only come from MHCLG. It was not ours to interpret accordingly. So one could share one's view, but that would not be the definitive position.
I appreciate that, but I think what we're seeking to understand is, did you share your view?
Yes.
About what you thought the appropriate interpretation was?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Now let's look at the witness statement of Stuart Taylor of Wintec. If we could go to WIN 702 at page 55, and we look at paragraph 124. Now, did you know that Wintec were a firm of facade consultants?
Yes.
Yeah. And what about Stuart Taylor? Did you know him? Did you have a relationship with him, professional relationship with him when you were working around this time at the BRE?
I recognise the name. I have probably exchanged correspondence with him, but I wouldn't know more than that.
Yeah. So he tells us this at paragraph 124. He says, I became aware of paragraph 12.7 in ADB 2 in 2007, probably shortly after the document came into effect. When I became aware of ADB, the first clause that I turned to was clause 12.7. And then he goes on in the next paragraphs to outline his thought processes as he read this amended version of 12.7. And I want to pick it up at page 56 and paragraph 127. He says this: because I was responsible for the upkeep of the specification clauses that Wintec used in their performance specifications, I felt that it was important to fully understand what the full meaning of clause 12.7 was. And he says, I knew that Sarah Colwell at the BRE was involved in the drafting of ADB2, so I called her by telephone to speak to her about clause 12.7. When I spoke to Sarah, I explained that I had read clause 12.7, but I did not fully understand what it meant. Sarah told me that the intention of clause 12.7 was to include all elements of the wall, including external panels. She told me that the clause was not restricted to requiring only insulation to be of limited combustibility. This explanation from Sarah Colwell was the basis of my understanding of clause 12.7. This remained my understanding of that clause from that point onwards. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Do you recall having a conversation specifically with Stuart Taylor of Wintec about the meaning of paragraph 12.7?
No, I don't.
So you can't help us as to whether that did take place in 2007?
I'm afraid I can't know.
And you can't help us as to whether this is an accurate summary of what you said to him?
Given that that is my understanding, as we've already discussed, of 12.7, if there was a conversation, that would probably have been the summary of that. But I have no recollection of a conversation along those lines, or of putting anything that would have been as definitive of that in place.
Right. Do you remember being concerned that if a facade engineer was calling you to try to fully understand the meaning of paragraph 12.7, there may well be other readers of the approved document who were also unsure of the meaning of that clause?
As I can't recall the context of the conversation, I'm sorry, it doesn't follow that I thought any more of it at that point, no.
Right. Following this call, do you remember at any time discussing the meaning of the words filler material, etc., in clause 12.7 with anyone else at the BRE?
It would have been a conversation with people like Tony and Steve Howard and Debbie in general terms of that type of conversation around that. But I don't recall it being a direct conversation that we was sort of sat down and reviewed.
Right. Just before we move on, I just want to touch on another point that Stuart Taylor raises in his statement. If we go to page 30 and paragraph 64 of his statement, and just look at the first 3 lines, he says this. He says, Wintec knew that organisations within the industry were incorrectly using or proposing K15 on new projects with a story equal to or greater than 18 metres above ground level, sometimes on the basis that Kingspan had undertaken a single test in accordance with BS 8414 Part 1. And in the last 4 lines of that paragraph, he says, I believe that Wintec requested the letter from the BRE to help us inform others within the industry that the test report dated 8th of December 2005 was not sufficient to justify the use of K15 on projects which had different cladding designs. Now, so that's the context, the use of K15 over 18 metres and a letter requested from the BRE about that. And then if we look at paragraph 65 below that, he says, I do not believe that in-person meetings between Wintec and the BRE occurred in relation to this. In the period from 2007 to 2013, I discussed this matter with Sarah Colwell of the BRE on a few occasions by telephone. However, I cannot recall when these discussions took place. Now, do you recall any of these conversations in which you were discussing the suitability of K15 over 18 metres with, for example, Stuart Taylor of Wintec?
I don't know. We wouldn't have been in a position to discuss single company products that had been tested by us. If there were discussions, they would and could only have been discussing sort of the generic matters around that, but I don't recall having a conversation with Stuart on those matters in that period.
Right. Did you remember having sufficient concerns about the use of K15 over 18 metres to discuss it? I mean, I know you said you shouldn't generally do that, but do you remember being sufficiently concerned that you did have the conversation about...
I don't recall that because the concern would have been in around 2008 with the BBA certificate, and from that point onwards, I'm not aware, or I have no recollection of discussing it beyond that at that time.
Yes, I mean, he's saying it's in the period 2007 to 2013.
I appreciate that.
I mean, are you saying he's simply wrong about that?
I cannot recall discussing with Stuart the use of K15 over 18 metres in that period at all. I'm sorry, I have no recollection of that.
Let's move then. I'm going to move to November 2013 now, and we're going to look at a series of emails between Brian Martin and your colleague Tony Baker at the BRE, into which you, Stephen Howard and Debbie Smith were copied.
Yes.
First of all, can you help us? What was Tony Baker's role in 2013? Which team was he part of then?
Pacifier.
Right. Now, if we go to the emails, this is at CLG 100005895. And I want to start, here we are, at the bottom of this chain, which is at the bottom of page 2. This is Mr. Baker's email to Brian Martin on the 25th of November 2013. And we can see you and others are copied in. And Tony Baker writes, Hi, Brian. I hope you are keeping well. I hope you can help with the following. We are seeing an increasing number of inquiries in which we are being asked for our opinion/interpretation of diagram 40 and ADB B4 clauses 12.6 and 7 in relation to the build-up of systems using board finishes, and we would like to reach a general understanding, so that we can respond to all parties in the same way. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then there's some bullet points. First bullet point, systems with board type outer layers. The boards are typically 15 to 20 millimetres thick and achieve a class B, S3D2. Clause 12.6 guidance references diagram 40 in relation to the classification of the finish, which would be acceptable over 18 metres as being B, S3D2. But 12.7 talks about insulation or filler materials which make up the wall being limited combustibility. And then the third bullet, as the minimum maximum surface finish is not defined, a debate has opened up within the industry as to whether or not the boards can be called the finish or the filler. And then over the page, he says at the top there of page 3, based on our experience from the original PII programme, we would suggest that the definition of the surface finish thickness and filler would assist in clarifying this point and would therefore be grateful for your thoughts. Best regards, Tony. So that's Tony Baker's email. Can you remember discussing this matter with your colleagues, with Stephen Howard, Debbie Smith, Tony Baker, and deciding that you needed to send an email to Brian Martin over it?
Yes.
And was it the case that the BRE themselves had not managed to reach a general understanding on this point by November 2013?
It was of concern that we had an understanding, and therefore, as others were starting to debate around that, the arbiter of that conversation needed to be MHCLG. It was not for us to speak on their behalf or to work beyond that. So we referred back to them to say, we're aware of this, you need to intervene at this point.
Yes. But as amongst the four of you, were you all clear on what the interpretation of those clauses meant? Or was there a disagreement even between you and your colleagues as to what it meant?
I believe we were all clear of that understanding, which is what we were sharing in the email in terms of what we understood and what was being suggested to us.
Right, but I'm not sure Tony Baker is actually putting forward a settled position, is he? He's just saying we'd like to reach a general understanding about these matters. He's not saying this is how we understand it's interpreted. No. Do you agree, is he?
No. He was asking the question in that way, yes.
Yeah.
To seek the opinion from Brian.
Right. But if you had all been agreed and you all felt it was clear, wouldn't the email have been written very differently? Wouldn't the email have gone along the lines of, we're all clear, we think it means this, do you agree? Industry doesn't seem to. But instead what we get is a series of quite interesting questions being raised about the interpretation of it.
I think they summarised the questions that were being asked of us.
I see. So your evidence is that you at the BRE were clear on the interpretation of those clauses, yes?
My understanding was we were clear, yes.
Yeah. You were asked about this in your witness statement. If we could look at that, page 64, paragraph 410. And you're being asked the specific question, did you consider that a definition of the surface finish, thickness and filler would assist in clarifying this point? If so, how would it do that? And you respond, you say, it seemed that this was a matter in respect of which definitions might assist the industry, given that BRE was being asked about this by the industry, as exemplified by the email from Andy Bester at Exhibit, and then you give the exhibit reference. Now, we're going to come back in a moment to the email from Andy Bester. So are you saying that the BRE didn't need any clarification, but the industry did?
I was saying by that point, there needed to be a clear statement because there was debate ongoing around that, yes. And as that debate increased, that then obviously leads to everyone questioning their understanding and interpretation of it. Hence the reason we refer back to the department to say, are we right or are we wrong?
Yes. But are you saying that the BRE didn't need any clarification, but industry did?
I believe at the point that this was being written, we had an understanding and that we were seeking to determine, given the questions that were being asked of us, whether we were correct in that.
Right.
I can't speak for those, for the other members of the team, but my understanding was that we were all at that time of a similar mind, and therefore when asking this question it was a case of we're being asked this, are we wrong?
Right, but just going back to the email that Tony Baker sends, let's look at the bottom of page 2 of that email string that we were just looking at. So it's CLG 1305895, page 2. he says at the end of that first paragraph, we would like to reach a general understand so we can respond to all parties in the same way. They're not saying, you're not saying we're being asked this, are we wrong in this interpretation, are you?
No.
No. Now, paragraph 398, back to your statement, page 62. Page 62 of your statement. Yeah, 398. You're asked the question, did you agree with Tony Baker that there was a need to reach a general understanding of the position? And you said, yes, in light of the number of inquiries received regarding the interpretation of approved document B, it seemed that it would be useful to have an understanding of MHCLG's interpretation, given that it was an MHCLG's document. And on those inquiries which the BRE had been receiving, if we look at 379, back on page 60, you tell us prior to this email, general discussions had taken place within BRE about the fact that BRE was being asked these questions, despite approved document B not being a BRE document, and that the queries should be referred to MHCLG. And then at paragraph 382, you explain, you say the discussions would have been within the passive fire team. I was not working in this team on a day-to-day basis, and so I was not aware of the full extent of the discussions within the team. But from memory, I believe that Tony Baker, Stephen Howard and Debbie Smith were aware of these discussions, yes?
Yes.
And then you also say at 387 on page 61, you say, from discussions with Tony Baker and Stephen Howard, I understood that the number of inquiries received by BRE began to increase from 2013 onwards. Is that right?
Yes.
And asked why the volume of inquiries had begun to increase, at 392, at the bottom of that page, you say, I do not know and I do not recall any specific events at this time in the construction industry that might have prompted the increase in inquiries. And you also tell us at 394, on page 62, look at 62, please. You tell us that, as far as you understood it, the inquiries were being dealt with by the passive fire team, so that was Tony Baker and Stephen Howard, yes?
Yes.
But that you and Debbie Smith would become involved if particular technical queries were raised. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, if we could go to the fourth witness statement of Tony Baker now at BRE 30043700 and look at page 3, paragraph 13. His answer was this. He said, so he was asked the question, in the period prior to 25th of November 2013, how were those inquiries being handled or responded to by the BRE? And he says this, questions regarding the interpretation of ADB with reference to cladding were generally directed to Dr Sarah Colwell due to her experience in this area. Now, is Mr Baker wrong about that? Were these inquiries being directed to you at the time because of your experience in the area?
I don't know the volume that were coming through to Tony and Steve, so if they were directing them to me, then that would have been on the basis that they felt I could address them better than they were able to. Yes,
perhaps because of your very long experience in this area, dating right back to the Connolly tests.
Yes.
Now, if we go to BRE 3047583, I promised we'd come back to this. This is the email exchange between you and Andy Bester of Trespa, which you exhibit to your witness statement. It's in November 2013. Now, Trespa are manufacturers of cladding panels, including high-pressure laminate boards, yes?
Yes.
And you tell us in your statement, we don't need to go to it, at page 60, paragraph 384, that it was inquiries such as this one which prompted discussions between you and your colleagues within the BRE and eventually led to the email to Brian Martin. Now, if we go down to page 3 and look at the bottom email on that page, sent from Andy Bester to you on the 25th of November 2013, we can see that the subject heading is interpretation, it should read of, B2 clause 12.7. And he writes, as you are aware, I sent you an email on the 18th of October, re the above issue, and subsequently spoke to you on the 30th. Since then, I've heard nothing. Whilst I appreciate that these things can take time, it is becoming very frustrating as more potential clients surmise that Trespa Meteon FR grade is unsuitable for their application. It appears that there are more and more differing stories developing in the industry, and I would like to think that a suitable solution could be forthcoming soon. I look forward to hearing from you. So this email, is this right, was about whether or not the product that Andy Bester refers to, Trespa Meteon FR grade, was suitable for use on the external walls of buildings over 18 metres. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Now, did you understand Trespa Meteon FR to be a high-pressure laminate board?
Yes.
And was that a material of limited combustibility?
No.
No. And we can see that you've obviously spoken to Andy Bester at the end of October about this, and this is a chaser email, isn't it?
That's correct.
Why had you not immediately referred Andy Bester to MHCLG, given what you've told us in your witness statement about the BRE's role as a testing house and that all matters of interpretation rested with the department?
At that time, that was when these were increasingly coming to the fore, and it was a conversation that I had with Tony and Steve to see if we could then engage with the department to take that forward.
Yes.
So,
if we move up this chain on page 3, sorry, had you finished your answer?
Yes.
Yeah, if we go up the page on page 3, we can see from the email above this that you respond 1 minute later at 13:25 on the 25th of November. You say, I will try and follow this up again this week. Now, can you help us? Who are you following it up with?
the discussions internally as to how to take it to the department.
Is this in fact the reason for Tony Baker's email to Brian Martin later that same afternoon?
That was part of that, yes.
Yeah. And if we go up to page 2, we can see that on the 4th of December 2013, at 14:20, it's at the bottom of that page, so it's right at the bottom, Andy Bester follows up again asking anything to report, please. And in the next email chain, you respond that day saying, we can see it at the top of the page, yes, there's currently an active dialogue on this topic taking place and a meeting to discuss and agree a conclusion is being arranged, yes?
Yes.
What was the active dialogue that was taking place?
Arranging the meeting with the MHCLG.
Right, so that was a meeting between the BRE and MHCLG, yes?
Yes, to make them aware of what was being said.
I see. And you said it was a meeting to discuss and agree a conclusion is being arranged. What was your expectation about what that meeting would be doing?
The MHCLG would be aware of that and agreed course of action arising from that.
Yeah. Now, if we go to the bottom of page 1 in the next email sent to you on the 4th of December at 16:42, we can see, sorry, at 15:49, right at the bottom, Andy Bester basically says, any idea on a timescale, as I've got clients awaiting the outcome. And then the next email up, you respond and you say, I should have a better idea tomorrow and we'll try to push for a timescale, yes?
Yes.
And why would you have a better idea tomorrow? What was happening on the 5th of December 2013?
I don't know. I don't recall.
You can't help us on that. And when you say we'll try to push for a timescale, push who for a timescale?
MHCLG.
Right. Yes, and we don't see it in these emails, do we? We don't see you saying either this. You're not saying, sorry, we're a testing house, go to the department, we can't help. Nor are you saying, well, 12.7 is perfectly clear to me, let me explain it. We don't see either of those things, do we?
No.
So can we take it from that, in fact, you did think at this time that there was something that lacked clarity that the department needed to address?
Yes, hence the request to meet with them.
Yes. And at the top email in this chain, just to finish off, Andy Bester chases again on the 12th of December 2013, if we look right at the top of page 1. Hi Sarah, anything for me please, trying to keep the wolves from the door, exclamation mark. Did you ever respond to that email?
I don't recall responding to that email directly, no.
Do you know why not? I mean, he was clearly anxious to get an answer about whether his product was meeting the guidance or not.
I don't know whether it was followed up with a phone call rather than an email. I really don't recall.
Yeah. And you accepted a moment ago that there was something that lacked clarity that the department needed to address. What was it at this point that you felt lacked clarity?
The fact that the industry appeared to be, as exampled here, interpreting in a different way, suggested that there needed to be a statement from the department of what the interpretation of that was.
Yeah. And the fact that the industry was reacting in that way suggested that the clause wasn't clear, yes?
The industry were obviously interpreting it in different ways.
Yes. Let's go back to the chain of emails between Tony Baker and Brian Martin. This is at CLG 1305895. At the top of page 2, we can see Brian Martin's response. It was sent at 15:47. That was just over half an hour after Tony Baker's email to him. And it reads as follows. Hi, Tony. I see where you are coming from. The problem we have with Class B is that you can have a thin surface that gives you the performance and back it with something less desirable. So there's no such thing as a Class B material. The word filler was introduced because of a particular incident where a polymeric foam was used to keep an aluminium panel stiff. The foam was not used for thermal reasons, so it wasn't insulation. It still burned, of course, ! Sarah will remember the details, I'm sure. I'm thinking out loud here, but I think a homogeneous Class B board would be fine, effectively a Class B material, but a lamination of board with something else should revert to the limited combustibility criteria. Does that make sense? Don't quote me on this yet. What do you think, Brian? So that was his response. What was your reaction to this response? We can see you're copied in.
That was not the response I was expecting.
Right. What response did you expect?
A confirmation of the statement as we understood it. But as say, the sense of it didn't quite follow through.
Right. Were you concerned that having gone to Brian Martin because you thought it would be useful to have the department's interpretation, he appeared to be undecided on the point and was thinking out loud back to you?
It was a slightly odd email to receive, yes.
Yes. And in fact, we can see he was asking for Tony Baker's input back to him, yes?
Yes.
Were you aware at the time that Tony Baker considered Brian Martin's response to be unsatisfactory? That was what he told us in his fourth witness statement at BRE 30437000, page 9.
Yes, so it didn't answer it didn't give the clarity or direction we were seeking.
And was that, in your experience, typical of Mr. Martin when you raised these kind of questions with him, or was he normally clearer about the interpretation of the approved document?
It was not always a definitive statement, no.
No. So did you quite often get a lack of clarity when you wanted clarity from Mr. Martin?
At times, yes.
Right. And did you have any kind of understanding of why that was, that you were often getting a lack of a clear response from him?
No. The feedback wasn't necessarily always answering the question as asked.
Yeah. Now, the particular incident that Brian Martin was referring to here, did you understand that to be the edge fire at Salford from January 2005?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. Now, in this email, did you understand that Brian Martin was positing that anything other than a homogeneous Class B board should somehow be caught by 12.7 of ADB and should therefore be of limited combustibility? Is that what you understood him to be when he says, I'm thinking out loud? He says, I think a homogeneous Class B board would be fine. Did you understand him to be suggesting that that didn't need to be limited combustibility? Class B would be fine if it was a homogeneous board. Yes?
So, on the basis that I think he's implying that the finish would be the Class B board.
Well, I think the important bit about that sentence, isn't it, is that it is a homogeneous
Yes.
Class B board. So what he's saying is a non-composite, a board that is
A solid.
a single material, doesn't vary.
Yes.
If that board is tested to Class B, he seems to be suggesting that's fine, it doesn't need to be of limited combustibility, yes?
Yes.
But he seems to be suggesting in the next sentence, but a lamination of board, so something which is a composite with something else, that needs to be of limited combustibility, yes?
Yes.
And had you ever thought about 12.7 in that light before?
Yes, we were beginning to think about it in that light, given the questions that were being asked around it. So that was very much where the thought processes were in at that period.
Yes. Now, if we go to another email string, BRE 30475584, we can see from the second email in the chain, sent at 13:56 on the 25th of November 2013, that before sending his initial email to Brian Martin, Tony Baker had sent a draft to you. And you can see that. He says, Sarah, can you confirm if this is what we're being asked? This probably goes a bit further, Tony. And he set out the text of an email to you below. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And we can see from the top email that you send it back to him at 14:50, so not long after, about an hour later, with quite a lot of amendments, although they're not marked up. If one did a comparison, you've changed quite a bit in Tony Baker's draft. You can take that from me. Now, we're not going to pick through all your changes, but I just want to ask you about one. In Tony Baker's email, so second down, in the first bullet point, if you go, he'd included the words, or the question, whether a cladding system with a board type outer layer, which is not of limited combustibility, but with a non-combustible insulation, requires classification to BR135, yes?
Yes.
Now, going up the email and looking at the top of the chain, your redraft, those words have been removed and they don't appear to have made their way into the final email which Tony Baker sent to Brian Martin. Can you help us with this? Just looking back at what Tony Baker had drafted in that first bullet point, why did you remove that bullet point? We go back to looking at the bottom part of the page. So that first bullet point there, can you help us as to why you didn't ask that question of Brian Martin?
What? I can't. No, I don't recall why that I would have taken that question or suggested that question was removed.
Yeah. Did you know what the answer was at the time to that question? Because it's quite a difficult question, isn't it? So you've got a non-combustible insulation, but you've got outer layers in respect of it, which is not of limited combustibility. I think what's being asked is that okay, or does that need to go through the full system test in BR135? Can you help us with what the BRE thought the answer to that was?
No, could you scroll back up to the...
Yes, of course, sorry.
To the redraft.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, no, I don't know where my redraft
Right.
is written in that way.
Okay.
No.
Okay. If we go on to a different document, BRE 304756, where we can see from the second email down that on page 1 you were copied into Brian Martin's response to Tony Baker. Yes, there. And then if we look at the top of the chain, we go to the top page, you send an email to Tony Baker and you send a proposed, basically what you do is you send Tony Baker a proposed reply to send back to Brian Martin, okay? And you can take it from me that this email that you send back to Tony Baker is identical to the one then that Tony Baker sends on to Brian Martin. So looking at that email, it says, hi, interesting one, Euroclass B has the potential to propagate flame, etc. The PII and DCLG cladding products use board systems, looking at the data, and then you go on. This would suggest to me that a clause 12.6 and hence diagram 40 is appropriate for surfaces coatings in the context of a decorative render finish, with the remaining system as limited combustible as 12.7. As you say, thinking out loud, we probably need to discuss in order to fully resolve, Sarah Colwell. And then if we look at CLG 1305895, you can see Tony Baker's email there on that page, copied to you, is basically the email that you sent to Tony Baker.
Yes.
Yes. It's exactly the same email. Now, what was the purpose of this? Wasn't it a bit of a waste of time to have Tony Baker sending your emails? Why did you not simply email Brian Martin yourself to ask him these questions?
Tony was making the direct contact. Tony and Steve were the lead in that area at that time. And I was basically asked for my view. I provided that back as a draft response for Tony to then work with if he wanted to update, draft or change.
Right.
So I wasn't expecting necessarily a verbatim copy of my email to be sent to Brian. I would have, that, if you like, was my interpretation of a response that I would have sent to him.
I understand. Now, going back to that correspondence between Tony Baker and Brian Martin, CLG 1305895, we can see the second email from the top, sent on the 3rd of December 2013 by Tony Baker. And bearing in mind that you wrote this, let's just look at it a little bit more carefully. So you say it's an interesting issue and one that we need to resolve one way or the other, yes? And then Euroclass B S3D2 has the potential to propagate flame either as a surface coating or as a homogeneous product, and more so if both surfaces are exposed, which in the case of systems with these boards can be the case as they invariably have a cavity between the board and insulation. And you go on, the PII and DCLG cladding products use board systems. Looking at the data, the systems appeared to have achieved a range of indicative B and C Euro classes, depending on substrates and fixings, etc. When these systems were tested to BS8414 and the 5 tests, none met the performance criteria in BR135. And you and Tony Baker say, this would suggest to me that clause 12.6 and hence diagram 40 is appropriate for surface coatings in the context of a decorative render finish, i.e. a non-substantial component scenario, burns off, doesn't propagate flame through the system, with the remaining system requiring limited combustible materials as 12.7 or the system to meet BR135 as 12.5. As you say, thinking out loud, we probably need to discuss in order to fully resolve. Would it be possible to arrange a meeting to discuss further? So is this right, that according to your assessment of the approved document at the time, the sections should be read to mean that certain surface coatings on the very external face of the external wall arrangement need only meet the requirements in diagram 40, yes?
Yes.
But the remainder of the system used should meet the limited combustibility criteria in 12.7, yes?
Sorry.
Sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry, I missed the answer.
My apologies.
If we move to the final paragraph of Tony Baker's email to Brian Martin, Tony Baker's suggesting a meeting to discuss in order to resolve, yes?
Yes.
And if we look at Brian Martin's response at the top of the page on the same day, he says, happy to have a chat, probably not this side of Christmas. This is on the 3rd of December 2013. I think it's important to remember that we never expected the ADB rules to result in a system that would always pass the BR 135 criteria. Do you see that?
I do.
What did you understand the final sentence of that email to mean? We can see you are copied in.
I'm not sure. I don't quite follow the understanding of the point that was being made in that final sentence.
No. I mean, on one reading, what it means is that what we've come to know as the linear route, if you follow the prescriptive guidance in approved document B, that was never expected to result in a system which would always pass the large-scale fire test. Yes? That's one reading of it.
One reading of it, yes. I agree.
That's an extraordinary proposition, isn't it?
I would agree.
Yeah. Given that as we've already discussed, given the extent of flaming that you can get even on a successful 8414 test.
I don't understand that comment.
No. Do you remember having a reaction to it when it was sent?
Not particularly. I think I looked at it with happy to have a chat and sort of resolved that we would discuss whatever the comment was. I didn't. Reading it again now in the context of where we are, that reads in a way that I didn't recognise it at that time.
Yes. Do you remember, did anyone go back to him immediately and say, what do you mean? The ADB rules really ought to result in a system that would always pass the BR 135 criteria.
I don't believe anybody went back now.
No. Why not? Can you help us with that?
I think it was probably read and left to when we met to discuss.
Right. Now, thinking about that meeting, do you remember attending a meeting with Brian Martin, which we've seen it was being discussed in December 2013 for this issue to be fully resolved? Do you remember that meeting?
Yes, I do.
Can you remember what was discussed?
The points raised in the email and how that would be addressed.
Did you make any notes of the meeting?
I'm not aware of any notes, no.
Right. And how was the matter resolved? How was it left at the end of the meeting?
My understanding was that Brian was looking to pick that up as the next resolution of the AD, which was being discussed at that time, that there was an expectation that it would be moving to review, and that would be picked up as one of the items in that.
Right. He said that to you at the meeting, did he?
That was my understanding from that meeting, that we would move
Right.
forward with it from that point.
And did the BRE express these points as concerns to Brian Martin, that you were concerned that industry was confused about this and you had concerns about it?
Yes.
How did you express those concerns? Can you help us?
We basically explained to him what was happening, what we were being asked, and that it was, whilst we were able, as said, to discuss the AD with people, it was not, we weren't in a position to make a definitive interpretation of it, because that was outside the role available to us. But our understanding was as we set out, and that if we were wrong, we needed to know that.
Right. Did anybody discuss what the potential wider public safety implications might be if this matter were not clarified quickly?
Given that we'd raised it with them, I'd taken the assumption that they would undertake the necessary steps to do that, having been made aware of it.
I see. And did Mr. Martin appear to be taking your concerns seriously at this meeting?
Yes, he understood the point that was being made, and had appeared to take on board that was the sort of the next steps and actions arising from that.
Right. Did he give you any idea during that meeting about when any review of approved document B might be in which he would pick this up as an item?
Unfortunately not, and with hindsight, that's probably one of the biggest areas of concern, that we'd never really pushed for that clarity.
Yes. And just to be clear, who else was at this meeting as well as you and Brian Martin?
Tony Baker.
Yeah. We see there's a meeting invite. If you go to CLG 1305953, we do have a meeting invite. It's very short. CLG 1305953. It appears to be a meeting invite being sent by Brian Martin for a meeting at Elland House. Elland House was where MHCLG were based, yes?
That's
this
correct.
time.
Yeah.
And the required attendees are Tony Baker and yourself, and then an optional attendee is Stephen Howard. Are you clear that Stephen Howard didn't attend?
I don't recall him attending.
Right. And we can see the title at the bottom of the page, A Discussion over the Application of Re-ADB Clause 12.6 and 12.7, yes?
Yes.
We don't need to go to it, but Mr. Martin tells us in his witness statement, paragraph 116, that he does not have any recollection of the meeting nor any record of it. Tony Baker, in his fourth witness statement to the inquiry, confirms that a meeting did take place at Elland House with you and him and Brian Martin, but he's unable to recollect anything of substance about what took place. The only other thing Tony Baker does tell us at paragraph 78 of his statement is that it was quite an informal meeting. Do you remember it being informal?
Meetings of that type with Brian tended to be of a fairly informal nature.
Yeah, and just describe that. What does that mean, informal?
It was very much a case of what was the problem, what was the concern, and what were the steps to move that forward. And it was a sort of an information exchange rather than a formally minuted, noted meeting. Right.
Yes, because it would appear that there's no written record of this meeting, no notes. I mean, wasn't it quite an important meeting that the BRE ought to have been taking notes from it?
With hindsight, yes.
Yeah. And at the end of the meeting, did you consider that the matter had been resolved, or did you consider that you just opened a dialogue and there would be further developments?
My understanding was that it was going to be taken forward as part of the review, and the review was forthcoming, and they were aware of that.
Right.
But whether they were going to take any intermediate action ahead of that wasn't discussed or agreed.
Yeah. At that meeting, did Mr. Martin accept that the clause was unclear?
He accepted that it could be be better written, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And did you indicate to him that it was causing a discussion, a consternation within industry?
We took the example cited, that was as we had for Andy Bester from the Tresfer, as an example of what needed, all the conversations that were going on at that time.
Yeah. And did you find out, for example, whether a homogeneous Class B material would be fine, but a composite material would not be? Did you get answers or any answers to your questions?
We didn't get definitive answers to the questions.
Right. And Tony Baker also tells us in his fourth witness statement at paragraph 83, he says, my recollection is that the issue was not resolved at the meeting, but that Dr Sarah Colwell and I hoped that Brian Martin and hence MHCLG would be better informed of the confusion surrounding these paragraphs of ADB, that's 12.6 and 12.7, so that they could take it into a consideration in future guidance or FAQs. Yes?
Yes.
Now, was the possibility of putting an FAQ, a frequently asked question response, out there for industry discussed at this meeting?
I don't recall it being discussed at that meeting, no.
Right. You can't recall anybody raising that?
No. My recollection is, as Tony's, that it would be taken forward as a revision. Right.
Now, I want to go now to some correspondence from April 2014. If we go to BRE 3047459, and if we look at the bottom of page 2, and the first email in the chain, it's an email from someone called Brenda Apted at the CWCT. It's sent to you on the 24th of April 2014. And she writes, she says, Dear Sarah, CWCT currently provides guidance on fire performance in Technical Note 73, fire performance of curtain walls and rain screens, copy attached. This explains the requirements of the building regulations and suggests how these requirements can be satisfied. And then she goes on, we have had numerous inquiries in recent months regarding fire and facades. Issues that have been raised include... And then she sets out a list of subjects over on, if we go to page 3 of this string, a list of those inquiries that they've had. First bullet point is the use of combustible insulation in facades, particularly rain screens. This is causing problems due to the greater thickness of insulation that is required if limited combustibility materials have to be used. And at the fourth bullet point, you can see performance of composite panels such as ACM is also on their list, yes?
Yes.
And directly under that first list of bullet points, we can see that she writes, we propose to hold a meeting to discuss the issues of fire and facades. 2, and then she says the aims are get a wider industry view, establish the adequacy and appropriateness of existing regulations, establish whether alternative solutions are available, establish what action CWC should take. So the CWCT is clearly thinking about that maybe it should take some action in relation to these issues, yes?
Yes.
And then she goes on, depending on the outcome of the meeting, we would propose to establish a working group to oversee the development of CWCT work in this area. The working group would be drawn from those present at the initial meeting, but may include others with specialist knowledge if appropriate. And then in the final paragraph, she invites you to their initial meeting. Do you see that?
Yes.
Let us know if you'd like to be involved by the date in May. Do you remember this correspondence?
Yes.
Had you been aware prior to this that the CWCT was receiving inquiries on these subjects before you actually got this email? Had people talked to you about this before?
I believe there may have been some correspondence, but I can't remember any specific detail to that.
Had you had any discussions with Brian Martin about the fact that the CWCT as well was receiving queries about these topics?
No, not at that point.
If we can bring up another document, CLG 3031072. CLG 3031072. So here we can see from the bottom email in the chain that we've got the same email from Brenda Apted, which you'd received on the 24th of April, but sent by her to Brian Martin earlier that day. Do you see that?
Yes.
His response to the CWCT on the same day, if we go to the top email on page 1, we can see that he's copied you and somebody called Neil Butterworth of Arup into this email. And he says this: "Hi Brenda, I'd be happy to help where I can. You might also wish to contact Neil Butterworth at Arup and Sarah Colwell at BRE, both copied in. They both have an interest in this subject, and I think they have been looking into some of these issues quite recently." Do you see that?
Yes.
And was it fair for Mr. Martin to say that you had an interest in these topics?
Yes.
When had you last, before this email, discussed any of those matters listed in Brenda Apted's email with Brian Martin?
At the meeting at Eland House.
So the meeting that we were just discussing
Yes.
on the 30th of January 2014.
Yes.
Right. So, and Brian Martin, was he right to say that you'd been looking into some of these issues quite recently?
I am assuming he's referencing the January meeting.
Right. If we look at her list, we can see it at the bottom of the page. So the first bullet is use of combustible insulation in facades, particularly rain screens, causing problems due to the greater thickness of insulation that's required if limited combustibility have to be used. Had you been looking into that?
We were looking into the queries that were arising around the questions of the different types of systems. So weren't looking at each of those individual points as raised, no.
Right, I see. What about the performance of composite panels such as ACMs? Had you been looking into that?
No.
And the performance, the one before that, the third bullet, the performance and location of cavity barriers in rain screen walls?
There was no specific activity going on looking into those individual bullet points. No.
Right. But you had, as we know, had these discussions about 12.6 and 12.7 of ADB?
Yes.
Yes. Now, going back to the earlier email string, if we go back to BRE 3047459, and we go up the chain to the middle of page 2, there's an email sent on the 24th of April 2014 that you send to Stephen Howard, David Gall and Tony Baker, yes?
Yes.
Who is David Gall? Can you help us with that?
He's a member of BRE staff.
In which team?
Not part of the fire group.
Right. So why was he being copied in?
There was, I think they were referred to as the Building Technology Group at that time, were involved with CWCT, so it was just an information exchange.
And we can see Debbie Smith is also copied in.
Yes.
And was Debbie Smith your line manager at this point? This is April 2014.
Yes.
And you write, this is something we need to be aware of and should consider being involved with because of the increasing number issues similar to those identified below, which we are being asked by industry. It also follows on from the discussion Tony and I had with Brian earlier in the year, which suggested that DCLG would be keen to see this type of document produced and then referenced in the FAQ area on the DCLG website. Now, just looking at that last part, does that help you as to whether or not you might have discussed an FAQ with Brian Martin when you met him in January 2014?
Yes, that may well have been a trigger for Brian to be able to reference an industry document.
Yeah. And you refer in the first paragraph to the fact that there was an increasing number of issues similar to those identified below, which we are being asked by industry. Can you just help us? What were those similar issues you were referring to?
So again, it refers back to the type of questions being asked by TRESFA.
Right, yes. And you say we are being asked by industry, so it was by people like Tresper you're talking about there?
Yes.
Anybody else in industry who were asking those questions of you?
There were questions. The timelines are a little chronologically maybe slightly incorrect, but there were requests from some of the consulting specifiers for discussions around 8414 and how it was used.
Yeah.
And there was just a lot more noise in the industry around the whole activity.
Yes. And following the meeting with Brian Martin on the 30th of January 2014, who at the BRE had been dealing with those queries? Were they still being directed to you?
I think they were being mixed within the team.
Right. And if we move now in your email on page 2, sorry, no, I've covered that. We've seen that there's talking about the FAQ. What did you understand in relation to that FAQ about who might be responsible for producing any such document?
DCLG.
Right. So you think now that you did discuss it at that meeting, but that it was left with DCLG to draft?
My recollection around the meeting at that time was that we had left it with them to determine what they were going to do with it. The nub of that conversation was around revision in the next AD. I don't explicitly recall how the FAQ part came to be, but if that's what I've written, which was much closer in timelines to that meeting, then that would have been part of that conversation.
Yeah. And you're saying it follows on from the discussions you'd had with Brian earlier in the year, which suggested that DCLG would be keen to see this type of document produced, yes? So is it right that Brian Martin had been keen earlier in the year for a document detailing the types of matters listed in Brenda Apted's email to be prepared and published on the department's website?
I think Brian was looking for some form of reference point if that was identifying the concerns in the way that we had.
And when you say he was looking for some form of reference point, do you mean some form of guidance to be able to point people to that would answer these questions?
I'm not sure. I can't really speak for him in terms of what he expected that reference document to contain. It was, as we've always said, a very loose conversation around what options, solutions might be there to present that. And as I say, my interpretation was that some form of document that could then be called up might be one that was suitable for DCLG's use.
Right, I see. Now, if we go to page 1 in this string of emails, and we look at the third email down on page 1, sorry, we need to go to a different string. We return to BRE 3047459. That's it. And we can see Debbie Smith sends an email on the 24th of April 2014 at 18:42 to you and Stephen Howard, copying in David Gall, Tony Baker, and someone called Irene St George. Who was Irene St George?
Debbie's secretary.
Right, I see. And we can see she writes this, "Whoa!" ! This looks very dangerous. We need to discuss our strategy to ensure that we don't end up handing the fire safety mantle to CWCT, a competitor, losing the need for BR135, BS8414, etc., etc., etc. I will get Irene to set up a meeting. Thanks, Debbie. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
That's quite a strong reaction Would you agree?
It was, yes.
Yes. What was your reaction at the time to receiving that email from Debbie Smith?
I was a little surprised.
Yes. I mean, we've been through the issues that Brenda Apted had set out in her email to you. Can we agree that all of those are important fire safety matters?
Yes.
And many of them are extremely important in terms of public safety, yes?
Yes.
What did you understand when you got this email, Debbie Smith, to mean by "this looks very dangerous"?
I'm not sure in the context of whether she meant of what danger she was referring to. When in responding, I sort of set out what I understood the position to be, in case she had perhaps taken a different reading of the document below.
Yes, we'll come to your response
sure.
in a moment, but it's fair to point out how you responded. Did you agree at the time that CWCT was the BRE's competitor?
No.
No.
I-
Sorry.
No, my apologies. No, I that's why I responded in the way that I did, because CWCT were a trade body at that point, and I can only assume that there was a concern that they would write some form of documentation that might overarch the or in some way take a route that was different to the ADV. I don't know.
Yes.
I'm surmising that.
Yeah.
I didn't discuss it with her specifically at the time.
Yes. That they might possibly put out some guidance in this area and fill the space, yes. What did you understand her to mean by the words fire safety mantle? She says, we've got to ensure that we won't end up handing the fire safety mantle to CWCT. What did you understand her to mean by that?
I'm unclear. I'm not sure what the scope of that mantle was that she was thinking about.
Right. Did you perhaps think it meant the BRE's reputation, its standing, its activity in this space in terms of external wall guidance that she was referring to?
I wouldn't have thought that, because CWCT already had a position in that space, so it wasn't as though they were stepping into anything beyond that.
Well, she's obviously worried, isn't she?
She is concerned, absolutely.
Yeah, and
But
she seems to be concerned about losing the need for BR 135 and BS 8414. Yes.
Yes.
So, doesn't it appear that she might have been concerned that whatever guidance they might put out would somehow lose the need for BR 135 classification and 8414 large-scale testing? Yes.
That could well be an interpretation of that statement.
Yes. Did you understand how the establishment of a working group made up of individuals with specialist knowledge to discuss action to be taken about important matters of fire safety, life safety, might lead to the loss of the need for BR 135 and BS 8414? Did you understand that?
No, I didn't.
But in 2014, the BRE was the only organisation in England capable of carrying out full-scale testing to 8414, wasn't it?
At that time, yes.
Do you think there was a concern at the BRE that there might be a suggestion that combustible materials be restricted or even banned for use over 18 metres, which would make testing to 8414 redundant?
I wasn't aware of that type of discussion taking place, no.
Right. Did you think that the concerns she was expressing in this email were really commercial ones rather than concerns about anything else to do with safety?
I honestly didn't review it in that much detail at that point.
Right. But the danger she's warning of appears to be about losing BRE income streams, i.e. BR135 and BS8414, yes?
That may well be one
Yes.
route.
Now, in the final sentence, she says that she's going to get Irene, who you've said was her PA, to set up a meeting. A meeting with who? Did a meeting actually go ahead?
I don't recall one directly going ahead, no.
She talks about we need to discuss our strategy. Did you ever discuss with Debbie Smith or anyone else at the BRE having a strategy in respect of this CWCT initiative?
No, I don't.
Were you ever given any instructions or direction from Debbie Smith or anyone else about how you should engage with the CWCT going forward?
No.
So did it just fizzle out, this suggestion of a strategy meeting?
I don't recall a strategy meeting taking place around this point. I think we continued the email exchange.
Right. So if we move up the chain, we can see your reply, which you sent that evening. You said, this document has been around for several years and was focused on curtain wall issues. The problem is now the issues we are seeing in the industry and that are not clearly defined in ADB, hence our meeting with DCLG earlier in the year and their suggested FAQ route. This CWCT revision would fit with that approach. We used to have good links to CWCT via BTG, but I'm not sure who's taken it on now. I'll follow up with Julie. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, and so in fairness to you, this response doesn't suggest that you thought there was anything dangerous about CWCT's plans, does it?
No.
You just don't pick up on that comment by her, do you?
No.
And when you talk about this document in the first line, this document's been around, were you referring to CWCT's Technical Note 73 from 2011?
Yes.
Was that a document you were familiar with at this time?
I was aware of its existence. I was not familiar with it.
Right. And in the last lines of your email, you refer to, we used to have good links to CWCT via BTG. Who's BTG?
Building Technology Group.
Right. And what was that Building Technology Group?
There was another group within BRE.
Right. And the reference to Julie, I'll follow up with Julie. Is that Julie Bragula?
That's correct.
Director of Fire Sciences when Debbie Smith became Managing Director in 2016, yes?
Yes.
Now, so you're saying there the problem is now the issues we are seeing in industry and that they're not clearly defined in ADB. So it does appear at this point that you felt that there wasn't clear definition within ADB, yes?
Yes, this is building on the conversations that we'd had with the department.
Yes. And was one of those issues the interpretation of 12.7 and the meaning of the word filler?
It was to do with 12.6 and 12.7, yes.
Right. And when you refer to their FAQ route and their suggested FAQ route, looking at the wording, does that suggest that, consistent with what you've told us just earlier, that it was the department's suggested FAQ route?
Yes.
Yes. Now, moving up the chain, we see a last response from Debbie Smith to you at the top of the chain on page 1, sent the following morning. If we could just look at that. And she says, this, Sarah, I suspect that no one has picked up the links, and that is another reason why it could be a threat. We need to consider what we are going to do, as we don't want everyone going to CWCT with their fire issues in the future. I recall, we'll need to check, that we had a draft IHS publication in this area. Depending on where it is, could that be reviewed to address a number of these issues, question mark? Now, did you agree with what she'd written there? She says, I suspect no one's picked up the links, and that's another reason why it could be a threat. Did you agree that it was a threat?
Picked up the links. I'm not sure what the links. Just picked up the links. I'm a little confused by what she's suggesting in that.
Yes, it sounds like you don't understand what she means by no one has picked up the links. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So you can't help us with what she means or what you think she meant by that?
No, I think I would suggest I didn't pick up the link.
Yes, no. Did you share Debbie Smith's view that we don't want everyone going to CWCT with their fire issues in the future? Did you share that view?
I wasn't aware that fire issues were, that the industry that we were working with were going to CWCT for their fire issues. So that's why I was perhaps a little confused by the response that was coming from this.
Right. Yes, I see. And she's referring to this draft IHS publication in this area. Do you know what she's referring to there? What was that?
I think there was an outline document that was being produced for the trust at one time that was never published because the third edition of 135 was produced.
Right. And do you ever remember discussing with her afterwards whether or not the BRE could pick up that publication, that draft, and refresh it and maybe use it to address a number of these issues? Was that ever discussed?
It may well have been discussed, but I don't ever remember any action taking it forward coming from that.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is that a good moment for
I
our
think it is,
afternoon
yes.
break?
Thank you very much. Well, we'll have a break now. Dr Colwell, we'll come back, please, at 20 to 4, and then we'll see what's left then. All right?
Thank you.
And as I said before, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. Thank you. Right, thank you. 20 to 4, please.
Thanks.
Would you ask Dr Colwell to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Dr Colwell. Thank you. Yes, Ms Grange.
Yes, thank you. Now, we know that following the invitation that you received from Brenda Apted, you did attend the CWCT's fire group meeting on the 2nd of July 2014, yes?
That's correct.
And in the period between the email exchange we've just read through between you and Debbie Smith in April 2014 and the meeting on the 2nd of July, did you go on to consider with Debbie Smith anything about what you're going to do to stop everyone at the CWCT stop everyone going to the CWCT with their fire issues? Was there any further discussion about that?
I don't recall anything, no.
Let's bring up the minutes of the meeting on the 2nd of July. It's at CLG 3019336. Here we have the minutes of that meeting on the 2nd of July and a list of those that were present. And we can see that you are third in the list. Do you see that? Sarah Colwell, BRE.
That's correct.
And if we go down to page 3 under the heading Combustibility of Insulation, we can see on page 3, we go down to page 3. Is there a problem with the system? I think the system's going very slowly. Here we go. So there's a heading in the middle of that page, Combustibility of Insulation. And it says below that, if we could just blow that up a bit bigger, limited combustibility insulation should be used above 18 metres when following the prescriptive requirements of ADB clause 12.7, but other materials, principally foil-faced phenolic foam, are often used in rain screen walls. There is a degree of ignorance, with some people confusing Class 0 with limited combustibility. In other cases, building control officers are permitting the use of Class 0 materials, making it difficult for cladding consultants to enforce the requirement for limited combustibility insulation. And then it goes on, higher standards of thermal insulation are requiring greater thicknesses of insulation, and in some cases this can only be achieved with the designated wall zone, within the designated wall zone, by use of combustible insulation. Architects are unaware of the problem and need to allow a wider wall zone to accommodate the greater thickness required with limited combustibility material. Now, you were asked about this in your statement, and at page 72, paragraph 475, you said you didn't have any particular recollection of this part of the meeting, and so cannot add to what's set out in the minutes. Is that still the case today?
That's correct.
If we look at your statement at page 73, paragraph 479, you say, yes, I did agree in July 2014 that other materials, principally foil-faced phenolic foam, were often used in rain screen walls. Yes?
Yes.
And then at paragraph 480 below that, you say foil-faced phenolic foam is a generic description of a product manufactured by a number of companies, and as such, I did not take it to be referring to any particular product. Is that right?
Yes.
And you confirm at paragraph 481 that you were aware that foil-faced phenolic foam was a combustible material. Yes?
Yes.
And then immediately below that at H, you were asked whether you considered in July 2014 that a phenolic foam insulation material could or should be used in an external wall arrangement of a building over 18 metres. And you said, I considered that it could be used as part of a system tested to BS 8414 and classified using BR 135, yes?
Yes.
Now, in July 2014, as far as you were aware, had very many different systems which incorporated phenolic foam insulation been tested successfully to 8414 and classified to BR 135?
There were not many that I was aware of, no.
No. Can you give us an indication of how many, even roughly?
No, I'm sorry, I can't.
So did you understand at the time that every building being discussed here over 18 metres using phenolic foam in a rain screen system would have had to have been tested in that specific system in the same configuration to that in the 8414 test?
My understanding is if it was being used over 18 metres, it would have to have had a suitable 135 certificate with it.
Did you assume that that was what had been done for every such high-rise building?
I assumed that there would be 135 classification evidence, yes.
Right. And did you check with any of your colleagues whether there were lots of other systems which could provide that test evidence?
At the time of that meeting, no, I didn't. I didn't have any reason to go back and check.
Right, I see. You've told us already that you were not aware before this point of any confusion or of there being a degree of ignorance about Class Naught and limited combustibility, yes?
No, I wasn't aware that the Class O was being confused with limited combustibility in the way that it was being discussed in that meeting.
Right. And were you surprised when you learnt about this at the meeting? What was your reaction?
I was.
Were you concerned about it?
Yes.
And if we go back to the minutes at CLG 3019336 and to the final heading on page 3, we've got use of ACM on high-rise buildings. And we can see it says ACM refers to aluminium composite material. The normal material consists of 2 skins of aluminium, approximately 0.5 millimetre thick, separated by a polyethylene core 2 to 5 millimetres thick. This material generally achieves the reaction to fire classification of Class 0 or Class B S1D0. There are versions available with a mineral core which can achieve A2 S1D0. There are also similar materials available with other metals such as copper used for the facing. Do you have that?
Yes, I do.
Now, pausing there and just thinking about the date on which you read these minutes, you were already aware of the existence of ACM panels of the type being described here, yes?
Yes.
We have seen that from the use of that type of product in the tests carried out in 2001 under Contract 1924,
Yes.
for which you were the project manager.
Yes.
Now, in your witness statement, you tell us at page 75, paragraph 499, that you can't specifically recall this part of the meeting and you've not identified any documentation to assist. And you also tell us that you can't recall whether Brian Martin was present at this part of the meeting, what ACM product was being discussed as the normal material. You can't help us as to who it was who stated that the material normally achieved Class 0. You can't tell us whether or not you agreed that the material did normally achieve Class 0, etc. So does it remain the case that you have simply no recollection about this discussion?
I have very limited recollection of this meeting taking place, and the minutes are my reference point to the discussions that were held around it.
Right. You said in your witness statement as well that you weren't able to give any examples of ACM PE products which could achieve Class 0 or Euro Class B, but what about the ACM product you tested in July 2001 as part of your work for the department? That would be an example of an ACM PE product which achieved Class 0, yes?
But I was unable to trace the actual manufacturer of that, so in terms of it exempling the product, I wasn't able to do so.
Do you remember mentioning to the meeting and saying, well, we do have some experience of doing a large-scale test on ACM PE. It passed Class 0, but it was a disaster on the rig. Do you remember saying that to the meeting?
No, I don't, and I don't recall that.
Right.
That being part of the conversation in the way that the minutes are reflected either.
Right. Isn't it odd that you didn't volunteer that knowledge, given that knowledge was so pertinent to these concerns being raised by this group?
In the context of the meeting, I can only assume it wasn't something that was a discussion point that was being raised.
Right. Were you ever told by the department that you couldn't discuss the results of that 1924 contract with anybody outside the group that were involved at the time?
No, I don't think there was ever an edict to not refer to that.
Right. If we go to page 76 of your statement and look at paragraph 506, you were asked, in July 2014, as far as you were aware, were ACM products with a PE or otherwise combustible core being used in the external wall arrangements of buildings over 18 metres? And your answer was, I was not aware that these products were being used in such arrangements. Now, thinking back to your work on contract CC 1924, if ACM PE products were in use in 2001 and selected by the industry then, why would you think that they would not have been in use in 2014?
I wasn't aware that these types of products were being used or being offered for test in the 135 scenarios or in general. And so it was of the assumption that they weren't being used in these scenarios.
Well, can we be clear about this? Are you saying, whatever you say in your statement, you may have had a chance to reconsider things since you wrote it, are you saying that you were not aware in July 2014 that ACM products with a polyethylene core were being used in the construction industry?
In 2014, I was not aware that they were being used as high-rise panels and products. No.
Well, that was a slightly different
answer
to a slightly different question. Were you aware that those panels were being used in the construction industry?
No, I was not aware that they were being used in the construction industry.
All right. Thank you very much.
Right. And just to be clear, no warning had been issued about the use of ACM PE products on high-rise buildings after your testing programme in 2001, had it?
No.
Those test results had not been released into the public domain, had they?
They hadn't, no.
And no one else from that list of attendees at the CWCT meeting would have known about those, would they? If we go back to the list of attendees, CLG 3019336, was any of those individuals, apart from, say, Brian Martin, but we understand he may have left by this point in the meeting, would anyone else in that list have been aware of the results of that testing that you'd done in 2001?
Without checking against the membership of the IAG, no, I couldn't tell you.
Right. But does anyone stick out as someone where you think, I remember they were involved?
No.
Did it occur to you, looking at the minutes again at page 3, that the reference to this being the normal material, ACM, and the normal material consisting of these two skins with PE in the middle, might mean that ACM with a PE core was being used on high-rise buildings? Otherwise, why refer to it as the normal material?
Referring back to this, yes.
Do you remember reading the minutes of this meeting afterwards?
I remember, reading through them.
Right. And in terms of the versions available, it says 5 lines down, there are versions available with a mineral core. Again, did you understand that to mean available on the UK market?
I took no particular overview of that.
Right. How concerned were you during this part of the meeting when you were learning that this group was concerned about the use of these PE ACM panels? How concerning was that to you?
In that they were discussing the panels, and I was learning their experience and knowledge. Then I was gaining a concern that was what was happening. Yes.
And did you, in July 2014, at this point, think back to that test? And did the subject of the use of ACM panels with a PE core trigger in you a memory of the performance of that particular material, given how catastrophically it had performed in those tests?
But it was not only the 1924 work, we were aware of ACM fires that were happening elsewhere at that time. So
Yes.
the knowledge that ACM was a problem was there and understood.
Yes. Did you consider in 2014 or at any other time that the use of a composite metal panel with a polyethylene core in the facade of a high-rise building would present anything other than a grave risk to the life of the occupants in the event of fire?
I would have been very concerned with the use of ACM on the outside of a building, yes.
Yes. Let's look at that final paragraph. We can see it says, there have been major fires in buildings in various parts of the world, including the Middle East and France, where ACM materials have been used for the cladding, with the ACM responsible for external fire spread. Yes?
Yes.
Now, I'll come on to what you knew about those fires in a moment, but if we just go on with the minutes onto page 4, just want to pick up paragraph 2, where it says, it was stated that clause 12.7 of ADB is intended to prohibit the use of polyethylene cord ACM in buildings over 18 metres, as they are not classed as limited combustibility. This is not clear from the wording of the current clause. The current clause is preceded by a heading, insulation materials / products, which implies that it only applies to insulation. The wording of the main text refers to filler materials, which could be taken to include the polyethylene core, but this is not clear. Yes?
Yes.
Now, in relation to this section of the minutes, you tell us in your witness statement that you can't recall who made the statement that paragraph 12.7 of the approved document was intended to prohibit the use of ACM PE products over 18 metres. And you can't recall the reaction of others to it. Now, is that still the case? Do you have no memory as to who was contributing to this part of the discussion?
I don't recall the participants in terms of their engagement with this part of the meeting, or any part of this meeting at this stage.
Now, from amongst the other attendees, David Metcalf has told the inquiry in his witness statement and also in his oral evidence that he believes that the announcement that clause 12.7 was intended to prohibit the use of these panels was made by you. And he's also told us that that interpretation was very different to the view that the CWCT had. Stuart Taylor of Wintec also recalls it was you who made this statement at the meeting. And Simon Hepworth of Lakesmere also thought it was you who said this, but couldn't say for certain. Those are from their witness statements to the inquiry. Now, do you think that Mr. Metcalf, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Hepworth might be right, that it was you who told the others that 12.7 was intended to prohibit the use of ACM PE on buildings over 18 metres?
Could well have been. I'd say it could have been. I can't say that I did, and I can't say that I didn't. If that's their recollection, then that would be the position.
Yes, because looking at the list of attendees, it's only really you and Brian Martin at that meeting who we know had been involved in discussing and formulating the wording of 12.7 of approved document B back in 2005 after the Edge fire. So wouldn't that suggest that it's likely to have been either you or Mr. Martin?
Potentially, yes.
Yes. Do you remember Mr. Martin not being present for part of this meeting?
I recall him leaving the meeting at some point, yes.
Yes. Now, thinking back to that section of the minutes we've just read, it records in 2 places, this is not clear. Do you accept that the view that it looks like you held about the clarity of paragraph 12.7 was not shared by the majority of those at the meeting?
Yes.
Yes. Mr. Metcalf has told us that there was an element of surprise for most people about this view, and that no one else agreed with the interpretation of 12.7, that it did prohibit the use of PE called ACM. Can you remember that the weight of opinion at the meeting was that 12.7 didn't catch these panels?
No, I don't remember that.
Do you remember others reacting with surprise to the news that paragraph 12.7 was intended to apply to anything other than insulation?
I don't recall that that set of discussions.
Was it a matter of concern to you that there appeared to be, at least as recorded in the minutes, a general consensus amongst the attendees that the interpretation and relevance of the word filler was not clear? Was that of concern to you?
Yes.
Because these were all very experienced professionals and some academics, weren't they? They were a pretty eminent group of people to be discussing this with, yes?
Yes.
Did it occur to you in 2014 that if, as expressed in these minutes, it was not clearly understood by this group of people, then it was highly unlikely it was well understood by industry more generally?
It suggested that would be the case, yes.
Yes. And did it occur to you that there was a clear risk that parts of the industry might have been considering that to be the case for many years?
That would be the natural conclusion, yes.
Yes. Now, I don't think we need to go to it, but David Cookson, who was also present at this meeting, and it was the time he was an employee of Kingspan, tells us in his statement, this is at page 17, paragraph 2.93, he says, to the best of my memory, there was concern in the meeting with the use of standard PC-ACM due to fires abroad, and that they may similarly have been used in high-rise applications in the UK. That was plainly a concern of those who were present during that section of the meeting. Do you agree?
I don't recall that discussion taking place. I recall what it, as it's been said. I can't speak to detail of conversations that took place in that meeting.
Right. We can see in the final sentence of this section of the minutes, just above the part that says breather membranes in bold in the middle, there's a question: how would this affect other materials used for rain screen panels, e.g. high pressure laminate? Do you remember that question being raised at the meeting?
No.
Was there an answer to that question at this time? Were you clear in your mind how, for example, high pressure laminate panels fitted with clause 12.7?
I had the view that previously presented, but we had gone back to the department earlier in the year and asked for their definitive interpretation of that, because there was discussion around that.
Right. Now we can see, if we go to the paragraph above that question, it says, it was suggested that clarification could be achieved by means of a FAQ. Approved documents can be downloaded from the planningportal.gov.uk. The page for each approved document also has an FAQ section related to that approved document. Sarah Colwell agreed to raise this with Brian Martin. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And you say in your witness statement, this is page 82, paragraph 547, you said, I'd not used this approach before, so I was not familiar with it, but I was happy to raise the matter with Brian Martin. Is that right?
That's correct.
So you hadn't used the FAQ route before, is that right?
That's correct.
You'd no familiarity with that?
No, it was something that Brian had raised and we had and would take forward.
Yeah. Now, help us with this. Did you ever raise the specific matter of an FAQ on this subject with Brian Martin after this meeting?
No.
No.
No, I didn't.
Why not?
At that point, I looked to do some development of a document, and in discussion then with other colleagues, with Tony, with Debbie, with Brian, with Steve, the introduction of the revision of the ADB was coming through, and it was assumed that, as we'd already had that conversation earlier in the year, that it would be taken up with that. And so I didn't pursue that conversation with Brian, which, with hindsight, is something I should have done.
Right, I see. So you say that in discussion with other colleagues, because there was this review of ADB coming up, and as it was assumed you'd had that conversation earlier with Brian Martin, that it would just be taken up with that. Were you happy with that position? Were you content to take that line?
At that point, that seemed the most appropriate way to address it, because the level of confusion seemed quite... it looked that the whole of that Section 12 would need to be reconsidered, and therefore an FAQ would, as a single point, would not necessarily address the whole range of the questions that were being asked and addressed.
I see. That was your view, was it?
That was my view. When I sat to try and look at the FAQ, it was something that was a more complex piece of activity than just a single set of lines.
I see. So you remember sitting down to draft the FAQ, yes?
Yes.
And realising that actually it was a total rewrite that might be necessary, yes?
If you were to use the approach of the FAQ, it wasn't an FAQ type approach. It needed the document, a larger document to go with that.
Right. And you specifically discussed not raising this FAQ route with Debbie Smith, yes?
Yes.
And Stephen Howard, yes?
And Tony Baker.
And Tony Baker. And all of you agreed that it was acceptable not to raise it with him, yes?
It was, yeah, it was a follow-on from the conversation that had taken place earlier in the year.
Was there any dissent amongst you about that? Was anyone saying, no, come on, we need to raise this with Brian Martin. This has been raised in the meeting. We've suggested an FAQ. We at least need to go and have another conversation with Brian Martin.
We were aware that Brian would have been in receipt of the minutes, and we were aware that Brian was aware that there was a need for this work to be undertaken, so we didn't pursue it again.
Did you think that the other people at the meeting who were expecting you to go back to Brian Martin to solve the problem in that particular way would feel perhaps rather let down?
Yes. On reflection, it is something that I should have followed up with the CWCT people with directly. I fully acknowledge that was a lapse on my part of not keeping them informed of that thought process.
Right. And how long was it after this meeting that you came to this realisation that it wasn't going to be possible to do this via the FAQ route, in your view?
Probably around the September time. We'd had a look at drafting it in July, and then followed up again with Debbie around August, September time.
Right, I see. So by August, September 2014, you at the BRE had all decided, had you, that you weren't going to raise this, yes?
We weren't going to pursue it that route, no.
Why is none of this in your witness statement to the inquiry? Can you help us with that?
My apologies, I thought I'd addressed the points. I'm sorry if the witness statement hasn't been this clear.
Right. Now, in terms of international cladding fires, we were looking at the section of the minutes. If we go back one page, at the bottom of the page, there's specific reference in the minutes of these meetings to international cladding fires. And we saw that it said there'd been major fires, including in the Middle East and France, where ACM materials have been used for the cladding. Now, can we turn to your witness statement and to paragraph, page 77, paragraph 516, where you're asked about any major fires that you were aware of at this point, and you say, yes, I was aware of the fire in the Tamwheel Tower in Dubai and several reported fires in Sharjah involving ACM materials. Now, as well as that Tamwheel Tower fire in Dubai, that was in November 2012, there was in fact a spate of external cladding fires which took place in the UAE in 2012 and 2013 and which were widely reported. Were you aware of others at the time as well?
Yes, those are the Sharjah Fires that are referred to in that.
Yes. So there's the Al Baker Tower, 18th of January 2012, the Al Taya Tower, 28th of April 2012, the Saif Belhassa Building, 6th of October 2012, the Al Hafit Tower, 22nd of April 2013, yes?
Yes.
So you knew about those fires. What did you know? Did you know that they involved ACM-PE?
Yes.
And how did you come to learn about those fires?
because of working relationships with the UAE, I was aware of the incidents that had taken place, and also that the UAE were rewriting their fire safety code at that time and were looking to use 8414 as the test methodology.
Right. And you say because of working relationships with the UAE, who were those working relationships with?
Civil defence.
Right. And I think you tell us, and I was going to come on and ask you about this, but I'll ask now. So you were involved in working with the UAE in helping rewrite their fire safety codes, is that right?
Yes.
Did you go out to the UAE?
Yes.
Yes. How many times did you go out there?
Several. A number of times.
Over what time period did you go out there?
I work out there quite regularly, so I would probably be going 2 to 3 times a year.
Right. And when you went out there, did you gain a very good understanding of what happened in those ACMP fires?
No, they were not always very forthcoming with the fire investigation details of them.
Right.
So the knowledge was from press reports.
Right, I see. But you specifically worked with the authorities in the UAE. Was it within any particular jurisdiction within the UAE that you worked?
The UAE set up a fire safety committee to look at external fire spread.
Right.
So I was part of that particular group, which was being run through the activities in Abu Dhabi.
Right, I see. And for how many years were you part of that group? It sounds like over a prolonged period, yes?
Probably around 2 years. That work was ongoing.
And when was that?
Probably around 2012, 2013, I would imagine, around the time of the fires.
Right, I see. And had you attended the UAE and discussed those fires out there before you attended the CWC meeting in July 2014? I think it follows that you had, yes?
Yes.
Did you tell anybody at the meeting that you had worked out in Dubai and you knew something about those fires?
I think that's what the reference in the minutes are to the other fires overseas.
That came from you?
I can only assume that was it, or if it didn't come from me, I would have commented around them.
Yeah. And what about the fire at the Mermat Tower in Roubaix, France, on the 14th of May 2012?
I can't recall if that was ACM or another external cladding material.
Right.
I would need to check.
Yeah. Having worked in Dubai on these matters or in the UAE, did you ever consider trying to find out whether ACMPE was in common use at height in this country?
I, with regret, believed that the requirements of 12.7 were actually there to prevent it being there. And I didn't look beyond that. And that's something that, I say, with reflection and hindsight, is with regret.
But you can't have thought that 12.7 was preventing that once you'd attended this CWCT meeting, could you?
At that point, no. That's what I say. That up until that point, that was my position. And having shared that at that meeting with everybody, those present were obviously aware of that position. That in itself, then, I say that window was not used.
Did you ever recall at this time coming away from that meeting and thinking, crikey, I've been working out in Dubai, I'm aware of these ACMP fires, and now I'm being told no one's clear here about whether these panels are covered or not. Do you remember thinking that was a pretty serious situation?
Yes.
And what did you do about that?
That's when I started to look at the options for that redrafting on the FAQ.
Did you, aside from the FAQ, did you discuss your concerns more generally with anyone within the BRE?
Yes, Debbie would have been aware.
Right. So you remember having conversations with her, what, about being concerned that the UK might have an ACMPE problem?
No, as I say, as we now know, my understanding of that position was that we had the regulation in place to prevent it, but obviously we didn't.
Right, but once you've attended this meeting at the CWCT, you can't have possibly have been saying to Debbie Smith, it's okay, we've got the regulations in place to deal with it, because you'd been told by some pretty important figures within industry that that's not how they were seeing it.
No, and that was the requirement was in place, but the interpretation appeared to be not as we'd follow, as we understood, or as I understood it.
Yes. And when you discussed this with Debbie Smith, what was her response?
Again, that was around the need to review and revise the guidance.
Did you ever discuss whether more urgent action ought to be taking place?
No, we didn't.
Can you give a reason for that now?
At that time, I genuinely don't believe we understood the extent of to which the material was being used.
Did you ever discuss this more generally with the department? Again, put aside the FAQ point and ADB. Did you ever have a discussion with Brian Martin or anyone else at the department where you said, hey, I've been working out in the UAE, they've had all these fires, this is a problem, you need to make sure we don't have that problem here, because people are telling me that they're unclear about how ACMPE fits into ADB and whether it's precluded or not. Did you ever have that broader conversation with the department?
That was the January conversation. There is a lack of understanding. It was not specific around ACM, but it was around questions that were being asked around that. So no, I don't recall having a direct conversation.
Right.
Although there would have been conversations purely on the basis that the work was ongoing in the UAE. So as such, that's where that interpretation of 12.7 would have come from. But as you say, post the July 2014 meeting, then that needed to have been ramped up.
Right. At that January meeting, do you remember discussing with Mr. Martin the Dubai Cladding Fires from 2012 and 2013?
They would have come up in conversation as examples of fire spread that was going on.
Right. And you said you don't think you discussed it specifically with reference to ACMPE. Why not? If those cladding fires were clearly being caused by ACMPE, why wouldn't you have had that discussion?
I think at that stage that there was an understanding in that discussion that was what 12.7 was there to do, but that, as I say, was needed to be addressed more widely, and why it was identified that there needed to be a redraft.
Right. Once you decided amongst yourselves in the BRE that the FAQ approach wasn't going to be the right one, why not do something at that point? Have a conversation with the department, or think about the BRE itself putting out some kind of statement to industry about the dangers posed by ACMPE panels?
At that point, my understanding was those conversations were taking place with the department as part of that redrafting process of when that was taking place. I agree. With hindsight, that stopgap should have been filled by some route, be that either the department making a statement or beginning that work earlier.
Right. And can you explain why the BRE itself didn't do something to warn industry about the dangers, given you knew about the lack of clarity in ADB?
In general terms, at that time, those would have been referred back to the department to address. We wouldn't have stepped into that space. That wasn't something we did.
Well, even if there was a real life safety issue?
The vehicle for dissemination of and the authority of those types of statements were expected to come from the department, from MHCRG as the authority making that view known.
But you advised the department on fire safety matters, yes?
And having raised that particular issue with them, for them to action that through their dissemination routes, yes.
You mean you raised it in January 2014?
Yes.
Right. And you talked about the fact that you understood that there were conversations, like about the Dubai Cladding Fires, going on between BRE and the department. Who did you understand those conversations were happening between?
I had flagged them with Brian at the time, in that period.
What, you mean you talked to Brian Martin about the Dubai Cladding Fires in 2012, 2013? Is that what you're saying?
That I don't recall specific incidents, but I would find it difficult to imagine that there were not conversations that were had about that at that time.
Okay. Now, if we go to page 78, paragraph 517 of your statement, you say in relation to the Tamwheel Tower fire and the fires in Sharjah, at 517, you say the video clips which were available on the internet at the time showed that the fire propagation was via the external cladding material, as the fire was clearly on the external surface of the building, yes?
Yes.
And at page, further down page 78, 518, you say, yes, it was of concern to me that this material was being used, and I was working with the local authorities in the Middle East on behalf of BRE to help them develop their understanding of BR 135 and 8414 testing, yes?
Yes.
And you've described to us your work as part of that.
Yes.
Now, just some more questions about the FAQ as had been proposed at that meeting. In your witness statement, this is at page 84, paragraph 564, you say at 564, in the end, no final FAQ was prepared, as ongoing discussions in this period referred us to the upcoming review of approved document B. Now, what do you mean by ongoing discussions in this period referred us to? Who are you referring to there?
Dr. Smith. And the release of the contracts to provide the technical support.
Right, so what did Dr. Smith say to you about that?
That the approved document review was was expected, and that the technical groundwork was being released to do that.
I see. So it's on the basis of that information you had from Dr. Smith that you understood that there were ongoing discussions about the upcoming review of approved document B?
That's
yes?
correct, yes.
Right. Was a draft ever prepared? When you sat down, did you actually put a draft of the FAQ together and then decide that wasn't going to work? Did you actually ever draft something?
Yes, I sat and prepared a series of bullet notes around the topic, and took that to discussion with Steve and Tony.
With Stephen Howard and Tony Baker?
Yes.
But it wasn't the question actually a very simple one? I mean, however precisely you formulated, what you need to know is whether a combustible panel with a Class 0 surface complies with paragraph 12.7 and diagram 40. Isn't that the question?
I think by that stage there were a number of questions that were arising, including the ones that had...
But that was the key question that people were in a disagreement about, wasn't it?
There seemed to be a number of key questions that were in disagreement. That was part of the problem when I sat to try to do that. I'd raised the points originally with the department on those three bullet points that have been picked up. And then obviously the CWCT had raised a number of other points in their meeting call as well. And the list of questions was becoming so large that it wasn't a single response.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Do you know what happened to that draft? I mean, it hasn't been disclosed to us.
It was a handwritten set of notes that I just took to a meeting with Tony and Steve. I didn't have a typed up. It was no more than a set of notes to talk through.
Right, I see. Yes, because at 565. You say in the second sentence, several outlines of the FAQ were discussed between BRE staff and CWCT representatives, but nothing was finalised, yes?
Yes.
So these were just, handwritten little outlines?
Handwritten comments, notes, and direction of what might or might not be included.
And over what period were those outlines discussed?
From the July to the September.
Right. And they were discussed with Debbie Smith, amongst others, yes?
Yes.
And if we look at page 83 of your statement and paragraph 555, you say, I recall that I discussed the matter with colleagues at BRE, Stephen Howard, Tony Baker and Debbie Smith, and CWCT. Drafting options were discussed which could be used either as an FAQ or, alternatively, as part of the upcoming Approved Document B consultation process. My understanding in this period was that Approved Document B was under review and there were ongoing discussions with MHCLG around the issues that may need to be covered as part of the review. This matter formed part of those discussions with MHCLG. Now, who was it, first of all, at the CWCT that you discussed drafting options with?
There was a set of conversations in early July. I believe Ian Keller may have been part of that.
Right. And looking at the last line there, when you say this matter formed part of those discussions with MHCLG, what are you referring to there?
The inclusion of the review of Section 12 in the upcoming ADB revision.
Right. Now, we don't need to go to it, but in his witness statement, Brian Martin tells us, he says at paragraph 119, page 42, he says, I do not recall being contacted by Dr Colwell in relation to posting an FAQ on the planning portal. So is he right about that?
Yes, he is.
Yeah. So you never thought, when you were sketching out these outlines and these drafting options, you never thought that it might be appropriate to speak to Brian Martin about that?
Not at that point, because we already had the conversation with him back in January around the content of that, and also the taking a formulation and a shape for the document at that point.
Right. And did nothing you heard at the meeting in July 2014, did nothing there make this a more urgent matter to raise with Brian Martin?
Given that Brian had been at the meeting and was aware of the minutes from that meeting, I didn't choose to discuss that further with him.
How did you know he was aware of the minutes from that meeting?
They were circulated to everyone who had attended.
Right. So you just assumed he was aware and what he would follow it up urgently if he thought appropriate to do so?
Yes, I didn't chase him on that.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I note the time.
Yes.
I am, I'm afraid, still a few pages out from finishing with this witness, and I think even if we sat a little bit late, I'm afraid, I think that could be very late. I'd probably want to have another hour with this witness.
Another hour?
Yes. And I know everyone wanted to see if we could finish today. But
well, I was rather anxious to try and finish this witness today, and I'm wondering whether some of the ground we're covering now is really very helpful. But
well,
I don't know what the ground is yet to be covered.
Yes,
So
I mean, I'm afraid there are still important exchanges and meetings to go through, and I couldn't do those in half an hour. It would take me certainly longer than that to do. Right. It's been a long day, and I do appreciate the witness wanted to get away, but I would rather start again at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Yes, well, Dr Colwell, I was really anxious to try and finish your evidence today.
Appreciate it.
And
Thank you.
I'd already made it plain to counsel and others that I personally was willing to sit late in order to do that, but by late I had in mind 5 o'clock or thereabouts. The difficulty is that if we sit too late,
Yeah, of course.
all of us, but particularly you, will get too tired to do yourself justice.
Thank you for
So I'm sorry. I think in the light of what counsel's told me, we will stop at that point, because there's no point going on for half an hour, getting tired and not finishing.
No, absolutely. Thank you for your consideration.
I'm sorry about that. So we'll stop there. We'll resume tomorrow, please, at 10 o'clock. I think you may have been warned that that was a possibility, and I'm sorry
Yes.
that it's come to that. And then we'll try and make sure you're out in an hour or so. All right?
That's very kind. Thank you very
So,
much for your consideration.
Thank you very much. Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence overnight, and we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Right, Ms Grange, 10 o'clock tomorrow then, please.
Thank you very much.